back to another episode of the Brainiac podcast. I'm your host, Stefan Bianchi. I'm really excited for today's episode because it's going to delve into the role of rules and referees and the roles that they play in managing concussion. And having been a hockey referee for 6 to 7 seasons, I'm sure a lot of this stuff is going to hit home for me. So I'm really excited to engage in this interesting conversation. And joining us for this episode is a friend of mine and the host of the Athletic Perspective podcast, Mike Jorgensen. So Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. Happy to be here. Happy to chat about this stuff.
Awesome. Just so our listeners can get a little bit of an idea of exactly who you are, I'm sure maybe some of them have heard of you because there's quite a bit of overlap between things that we talk about. But I'll just give a quick bio, if that's all right. So
for sure.
Mike is a third-year PhD student in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education. Similar to myself, I'm a master's student. He's a PhD student. We work together a little bit. He specializes in research on sport-related concussion prevention. He's a member of the coaching staff with the Varsity Blues men's rugby team here at U of T, and is also a former OUA men's rugby all-star. And as a longtime member of the Canadian rugby community, Mike's current research focuses on the experiences of referees in managing concussion, working with Rugby Canada to implement a protocol known as the Blue Card. The Blue Card aligns Rugby Canada with the recommendations of Rowan's Law, requiring sport organizations to have protocols in place for the removal from play and return to play following a suspected concussion. So thanks again, Mike, for joining us. Quite the resume there. I know we're going to have a pretty awesome conversation today.
For sure.
Okay. And just before we get into maybe the meat of the conversation, I do want to just have a little bit of a fun icebreaker question, if that's all right with you.
Absolutely.
And it's a rugby specific question, so we'll stay on theme. So the question is, if you could play one rugby game anywhere in the world, where would it be and who would you play against?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think right now, I mean, there's so many cool places to play a game. I think right now, having sort of just coming out of COVID and not having done a lot of travel, maybe somewhere warm, coming out of winter too. I know there's a bunch of sevens tournaments, beach sevens, that are played down in the Southern Hemisphere, which I think sounds really fun right about now. So probably there. And I guess keeping with that theme of, reconnecting or doing something that we haven't done very much of in the past couple of years, probably a bunch of friends along with that. So maybe guys I used to play with or whatnot. I think that would probably be my choice right about now.
Sounds good to me. If you have friends involved in some warm weather, I mean, not much more you could ask for, right?
Right.
Alrighty. So now let's turn our attention back to concussions and get into the thick of things here. So I just want to start with a bit of a general overview of injury prevention in general. So can you give us a quick overview on the difference between primary, secondary, and then tertiary injury prevention, just so we can ground ourselves in that before we get into our larger conversation?
Yeah, when we talk about injury prevention, it's a lot of the research is structured sort of looking at it in those three different stages, I suppose. Primary is concerned, obviously, with preventing the injury from occurring altogether. So with the context of concussion, it's preventing events that would lead to head injury, such as high tackle situations and stuff like rugby, or cross checks to the head, like in the NHL, so forth. So things like that, trying to prevent incidences that can lead to those injuries. Secondary, this basically comes into effect as soon as the injury has occurred or is suspected to have occurred, and deals with the immediate identification and management of that sort of during that acute phase. So again, with concussions, the big concern there is making sure members of the sport community can identify when a potential concussion injury has occurred, and then getting that athlete removed from play so they can go under further assessment. And then tertiary comes along, looking at the sort of long-term implications of that. So with concussions, this could be, experiencing symptoms for up to, say, 3 months, 6 months, a year, so forth. And so tertiary injury prevention is looking at dealing or minimizing the effects of those long-term outcomes. So secondary is really looking at make the athlete safe in the moment, identify and manage that sort of in that acute, whereas tertiary looks at that more long term and the sort of health outcomes that can come alongside that.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that. And I think anyone listening can understand that all three are important. But when it comes to concussion work, historically, has it focused maybe on one aspect in particular of these three sort of stages of prevention over the other?
Yeah, primarily the focus has been on probably secondary prevention. I know now there's a little more work into tertiary prevention, looking at things like long-term mental health outcomes, retirement from sport following head injuries, stuff like that is now emerging as new areas of research. But historically, it's focused on secondary prevention. And I think, if we look at this historically, we can see how that kind of makes sense. We don't know a lot about this injury. It's something that happens, but we don't really know the specific causes of it, or at least we didn't at the time. We're a lot more aware of those things now. And so taking a conservative, safe, athlete-focused sort of approach makes sense. Let's get the athlete off. Let's get them, recovering. Let's play it safe. Until we can figure out more about what's going on with this injury. And so that's mostly where it's focused on up until this point. And we can see that with things like baseline testing as sort of emerging as one area. And now biomarkers is really falls into that secondary prevention sort of realm. Yeah,
I think that's fair. And I think understandably so as well. Like some people may argue that more focus should be placed on primary prevention. Like, let's try and stop this injury before it happens. But especially when it comes to concussion, that might be harder than we think to do. But can you maybe speak as to why it's harder than people might think to prevent concussion before it happens?
Yeah, I think often when it comes to sports, there's this sort of accepted standard of risk taking that's involved with sport participation. And associated with that is this idea that, this is how the game is, this is how we're going to play it, and almost a culture mindset around that, where when you change or shuffle around rules or look to make adjustments on things like what gets penalized, or like for instance, taking fighting out of hockey. You could make the argument that letting two guys punch each other in the face is probably not very conductive to positive head health, right? And yet when you challenge that and say, hey, perhaps we should take this away, there's a lot of pushback, and it makes sense. The folks become, that's what they like about the sport. They like that risk taking. They like the aggression. This is what draws spectators. This is what pays the bills in professional sport, so to speak, right? But at the same time, it's a very simple fix that could have a big impact on concussion incidence rates. Whereas with secondary prevention, you don't really have that. It doesn't necessarily, you don't need to change the dynamic of a sport or the culture of a sport to have that impact, where the focus is on, preventing re-injury, preventing those long-term health outcomes. And as research has developed too, that's as severe and serious as concussions can be. A lot of athletes do recover and return to play quite successfully following head injury as well, right?
Yeah, the point you make about, like, there's only so much change to a sport that you can make before there's pushback or before it's not the same sport to a certain degree. I think concussion even compounds that point, because you can take hitting to the head out of hockey, which they have, which I think we both agree with, but people can get hit in their shoulder and then hit their head on the boards. Like, you can't really prevent that either. So it makes it even harder when you think about concussion. Yeah,
and just the physicality of sports, even if there's no direct contact or collision sort of involved with that, like soccer isn't a collision sport or the same way rugby is, but it's certainly a contact sport. Two guys go up to head a soccer ball, and what's the potential outcome? You hit heads, you get a concussion, right? Absolutely. And so that this is why there can be pushback to those things, because and which often is what the argument falls back on. And when I say, you can't change the culture, it's difficult to change the culture, that's not necessarily my perspective. That's the broader perspective of others. I think there are things we can do to make adjustments that don't take away from the what we inherently value in sport in terms of competition and physicality. But that's the argument that it often comes back to. Well, that's just hockey, or that's rugby.
Absolutely. And like the people who make the decisions tend to sometimes believe in that way. So we're not arguing with people who have the same beliefs around head injuries as us. We're often working with people who don't see the importance as much, and that makes any change even harder to come by. So I think that's an important distinction that you make, and it's a good one too. So talking about secondary injury and giving some of those real good reasons as to why it's been a priority, let's move in now to your work that's focused on secondary prevention. That's the blue card in rugby. So can you just give our listeners an introduction of what the blue card rule is and how it works?
Yeah, so the blue card has been trialed in amateur rugby or domestic rugby within Ontario. It was trialed in 2019 and is now implemented across all levels of amateur rugby competition within Ontario under Rugby Ontario's sort of governance. So I'm not entirely sure if this will include OUA. I'm not sure if it'll include the OCAA, and I'm not sure whether high schools will fall under that jurisdiction too, because technically they're not under the governance of Rugby Ontario. They're under their school boards and so forth. But within the club system, they've implemented this blue card. And so much like if you're familiar with soccer or rugby, much like when a player does something very bad, a yellow card gets pulled, or if it's really dangerous and really bad, then a red card gets pulled. Yellow, you're off for a bit of time. Red, you're out for the game. And there's some follow-up associated with that. So much like the carding system established in both sports for as a sort of punitive aspect, the blue card comes in as more an injury recognition piece. And so it says, hey, a potential concussion incident has occurred. So the referee then has the power to pull a blue card, which removes that athlete from the game and puts into motion an injury sort of management and tracking process. And so the idea is the athlete's removed from play, they get the blue card, and it's logged onto the online registration system, which is what we pull the game sheets from. And so in order for a player to be named to a roster, they can't have a blue card sort of tagged on to their profile. They get the blue card, their profile gets tagged with the blue card, and until they go through proper return to play and get medical clearance and go through that process, they're not able to be named to a game sheet.
Wow. Okay.
And so on one hand, it works as a way to track potential injuries. And so one of the first steps is getting confirmation or diagnosis from a medical professional, so doctors or nurse practitioners here in Ontario. And then that's uploaded. So then it's, okay, here's a potential incident. Okay, now we have confirmation, or it's confirmed that there is no head injury. It could be something else. And then again, that goes through the process, the blue card's removed and they can return sooner. But on the assumption that they do have a formal diagnosis, then they go through the proper return to play, as has been sort of established for the last couple of years now. And then at the end of that, before returning, they get the medical clearance, that's uploaded, the blue card's removed, and they can be named to game sheets again.
Okay, that's really interesting. So it's not only a mechanism to make sure like a player is taken care of in the moment, but because of the tracking system, it ensures that they're being rehabilitated properly. So when they do come back, there's sort of an understanding that they're healthy and good to go. And the league knows about that, not only just the team.
Yeah, I think I'm hesitant to say it sort of ensures it, but it definitely encourages it, because there are certain situations where perhaps they just don't follow return to play and they just wait a couple weeks and then they
Okay.
get the doctor's clearance, right?
Hmm.
So it's not super robust on that end, although that is something that, Rugby Canada and Rugby Ontario is looking forward with.
Okay.
And then looking at that sort of in the moment, when the referee or match official pulls a blue card and that athlete's removed, they are allowed to be substituted. A
Okay.
player is allowed to be substituted back on in that instance.
Okay.
So, and it's important to sort of position this from more historical or changes over the last couple of years, because the ability to remove a player, the match official's ability to remove a player due to injury or even concussion, like that's not specific to the blue card.
Okay.
They've had that the power responsibility to do that before, but this
Okay.
formalizes it much
Yeah.
further by using that carding system and then the injury tracking and management system that sort of comes after that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like the card almost gives it a little bit more, not authority may not be the right word, but credibility or legitimacy, where people now sort of realize that there's a role for refs. Because before you mentioned that refs had the power to do that before, maybe particularly to rugby, I didn't know that until I learned about your work with the blue card. I didn't know that. So I wonder if even from like an optics perspective, just having a card not only makes it more like visible for players and coaches to believe this is serious, but even from the outside looking in, maybe it's something that other league can like adopt. And we can talk about that later, but now it's like it's a formal thing. I feel like that makes a big difference.
It definitely formalizes the process in that sense, in my opinion. It also provides this sort of tangible
Hmm.
thing. We're used to the carding system in rugby. We're used to,
Yes.
hey, you don't debate a yellow, you don't debate a red card. Those are things that, it happens and you just, you move forward. So I could see it from a referee's perspective, saying this adds a level of formality or confidence to the decision that can
Yeah.
potentially be a bit of gray area where it's okay, well, I saw an impact, but they seem to be fine, but that was a pretty hard impact, but they kind of grabbed their head. But, and so this is why even the language around it is that
Yeah.
it's a suspected concussion incidents rather than, obviously the match officials aren't expected to diagnose or know for certain.
Hmm.
It's, when in doubt, sit them out is sort of
Yeah,
the axiom there.
for sure. And just one other quick question about the actual implementation of the rule. So when a player gets a blue card, are they out for the remainder of the game, or is it possible that after being assessed by the medical personnel, they're allowed to re-enter the game at some point?
Sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, sure. So after a blue card, let's just say a player is going to get assessed. Is there an opportunity for them to rejoin that same game, or is the
No.
blue card like you're out for the entire game no matter what?
Yes, you're out.
Okay.
So how it works in domestic rugby competition here in Canada, there isn't, we don't have field side physicians or team
Okay.
medics. We do have, your athletic
Hmm.
therapists and so forth, but they're not trained to diagnose, right?
Okay.
It's nurse practitioners, it's physicians. And so when we look at that process domestically, there's just not the resources for that. And it's a lot to expect of others to
Mhm.
make that decision. And so the idea is if it's an event that results in a blue card being pulled, it's serious enough that that athlete, regardless of accuracy in that call, shouldn't be going back in.
Yeah.
And so there's no field side head assessments or head injury assessments that happen at that level.
What? I think that's fair and probably way more responsible and beneficial to the player, even though it may be frustrating. I think that's definitely the way to go, especially like you said, when there's no one there to make a formal diagnosis. The last thing you want is someone coming back in if they feel like they're okay or the coach thinks they're okay. At least this now gives them no options. Like, no, you're out and it's for your own good kind of thing.
Yeah, you contrast this with professional sports, NHL,
Hmm.
NFL, whatever. At the professional level of rugby, even they have head injury assessments as part of that process, but they
Hmm.
have, team doctors, they have,
Yeah.
folks and the resources to support that type of decision making. Whereas at the amateur level, you're lucky if the athletic therapist isn't one of the players' moms who's a nurse, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Especially when you get out, perhaps in Toronto or the GTA or some of the more developed sort of urban areas, but you get out to rural areas, and then it's like, okay, well, not only that, but it's also an hour and a half to the nearest hospital too, right? So there's limitations at that level, and yet we see comparatively, just based on how many people participate at that level, there's a huge potential for injury, for concussion injury there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. Something I'm really interested to learn about now is, how did you actually begin the process of working with these rugby associations to implement this rule? Because from my understanding, is this the first time it's been implemented in Canada, or at least in Ontario, correct?
Yeah, in Canada. It's been trialed. I think it was developed in New Zealand. It's been trialed in a few other countries, France, I believe the UK, a few other spots. But the blue card as a sort of process or protocols is relatively new, and it's especially new here to Canada. And as you mentioned before, like I used to play, I coach rugby. I am certified as a referee, although that came right before COVID, so I actually haven't had a chance to engage in that role. But I'm involved, you could say, and part of that, as with any sport, I think the rugby community in Canada is quite small, and so part of when I started my PhD work, and sort of looking at these changes coming down the line, I reached out to some of the administrators at Rugby Canada and said, hey, I'm interested in looking at the blue card stuff. I know it's been trialed. It'd be great if I could just sit in on a meeting and chat with you guys about it. And so they invited me to the meeting, and then from there, I just kind of said, here's my thoughts on this from a research perspective, also bringing in my experience as an athlete and so forth. And they invited me on as part of the blue card working group, and it's just sort of developed from there.
That's a pretty cool story. Was there any hesitancy on their part to bring in this rule, or were they kind of on board from the get-go?
Well, just to clarify, I'm not the one who proposed this. This is 100% them developing and putting that forward. So the blue card has always been directly a decision coming down from Rugby Canada, which, knowing that they made the decision to trial it and they're interested in learning more. I've worked with sport organizations before. I know sometimes resources and capacity for the research side of things can sometimes difficult, and so I saw an opportunity as a student and an academic to offer some of my experience in that. And so, knowing that their decision was to implement the blue card, I came on and sort of helped with that process. Okay,
so this was something that they had sort of been planning to do, and you collaborated with them on that.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, interesting. And I guess that's like a bit of an omen to them, because they were seemingly still one of the first, at least the countries to implement it, even though it has been trialed in a few others. Like, it's still pretty good on them to have the foresight to bring it in. So that's still like really good on their part as well.
Yeah, and I think when we look at sort of the optics of it more broadly, here in Ontario, we have Rowan's Law, which was developed after the tragic incident of Rowan Stringer, who passed away due to subsequent head injuries or concussions suspected from playing rugby. And so here's a member of the rugby community that the provincial concussion legislation is named after. And so I think there's almost a bigger sense of responsibility there for Rugby Canada to be leaders in this too, and to say, hey, anything we can do is we'll do, or we'll try, or we'll look at. And so, again, that's where I came in to help sort of evaluate some of this some of the implementation process there with the match officials specifically and their experiences. But yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a great point that you make in terms of kind of taking it one step further than just Rowan's Law. They felt that sense of responsibility, and I have a lot of respect for that as well. One thing that you've spoken about is the ability for now this to work as sort of an injury tracking. There's an injury track component to this rather than just the initial injury management perspective. So how sort of effective has the initial research found that process to be?
In terms like with the blue card?
Yeah, so there's that online injury tracking component to that. And as some of the research we mentioned, we spoke offline, looks a little bit more at how effective that has been, correct?
Yeah. So when it's been used in other countries, they use it. It's been successfully used as to get an estimate of how many concussions are happening at what levels and some details there. Obviously, here in Canada, it was trialed in 2019. Haven't been playing too much rugby since.
That's true.
I think with the trial, I believe there was 7 blue cards pulled that season, and it was trialed across 3 or 4 levels of competition. So it's a very small sample size to really determine any sort of effectiveness there. But I think, if we look at it conceptually, it will serve an informative role there. The data is, electronically submitted, electronically collected. It's tied to the registration system. They can pull reports at the end of season. And so I think on that front, it also helps inform future decision-making when it comes to concussion injuries. Yeah,
that's a great point. I think the thing that sort of went off in my head when you told me about this injury tracking component is like one of the big things with concussion research has been like just estimates of the incidence of the injury. It's hard to do because we just don't have the data, or there's a lot that goes unreported. So do you think this blue card and the fact that it's like a formalized thing that will go to an online system, do you think it'll help, at least within the context of rugby, and make more informed estimates about the actual incidence of concussion, and then, like you said, informed decisions moving forward?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when we look to sports sort of beyond rugby, and maybe even in rugby too, there's this belief that if it's really hard to manage something that you don't have estimates on. And so this is where concussions, as you mentioned there, is so problematic, where the estimates are all over the place. And alternatively, where here in Canada, sports maybe aren't as well funded as in other nations, perhaps hockey's the exception there. But even still, it takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of resources to get to a point where you have the electronic systems set up, you have the institutional knowledge to assess the reports, you have the know-how to translate that information into action. And so I think it's a lot for sport organizations to implement something like that. But without that, it's really hard to make those informed decisions. And so you could be making decisions and hoping there's a change, but if you don't measure it, then who knows, right? And so I think that speaks to, again, we go back to secondary prevention as being so important and kind of being the primary focus so far. We can see why that makes sense, because without that, without the management, without the recognition of or accurate estimates of the injury, well, everything else, it's really hard to manage the rest of it.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I think there's going to be, I hope that there will be some more of this lens, or this approach taken to some other sports, and then we can see some better decisions being made. But now I want to talk about something a little less, let's say, not as academic, let's say, but something I'm actually really interested in. So having been a ref myself, I know that players and coaches get very invested in the games, rightfully so. So my question is like, how has this rule been received by coaches and players? Because I can imagine a world where they aren't happy that a ref has the power to permanently remove a player from a game, like based on their judgment about what is it or isn't, or what could or couldn't be a concussion.
Yeah, I think, we would hope that in every single situation, the athlete and the coach, and even, we're talking amateur sports, so the parents and, the spectators and everyone's just on board where they see something, they see a blue card go up and everyone's like, okay, let's get this athlete off. Let's make the safe decision. In reality, that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And, even just talking to some of the match officials, those situations, it's not like they occur often, but I found, at least through our discussions with the match officials, with my research, that they all remembered those situations quite explicitly, a lot more than the ones that went right, for instance. But also keeping in mind, like I said, with the blue card, there was only 7 situations that resulted in a blue card being pulled. So it's still very novel in that sense. But, they were able to share experiences of removing athletes without the blue card because they were still able to do that.
Okay.
Before. And you get things like the coach is yelling at you, the athletes, no, I'm good, when they can't, they're having a tough time even standing up. And then, well, okay, it's close to the end of the game, well, it's a playoff game, and all of these sort of things that kind of come up and are involved in that decision making. And so I think this speaks to the value of something like the blue card that formalizes that, where it almost takes away or further establishes that responsibility or the, I don't want to say power, but essentially the power of the match official to do that, to make that decision.
Yeah.
So it adds confidence there.
That's very true. I remember this is like based on our conversations, like outside of this episode, something that you mentioned a lot about is like the culture in rugby. There's like a real strong culture of respect. And I think like refs may feel more confident in maybe showing a blue card, because there's that aspect of respect. Of course, conflict is going to happen, but I wonder if that culture of really respecting officials and kind of what they say, if that makes this process a little bit more manageable, let's say.
Yeah, it's hard for me to speak too specific on that, just because I didn't do any sort of comparisons. Okay. So the vantage point of the comparison is just with other match officials' experience.
Yeah.
So everyone's within that culture, and even within that, it's this belief that there's respect for the match official. This is something that's just inherent in rugby. There's almost a belief, and the game's safer than it was before, and this is just rugby. Like you shake your opponent's hands after the game, you guys go have a beer, like all that sort of stuff. And yet this still happens. Referee abuse still occurs. The coaches still yell. Players still think they know the rule book better than the match officials. Myself included at some points in time. And I think just because there's that culture that, again, perhaps makes that experience different than the match officials or referees in other sports, that doesn't mean that, there aren't still extreme circumstances with that. And I think, and we see that when it comes to referee numbers and referee retention rates within rugby and other sports too. As a hockey referee, I'm sure you've seen friends that were referees and don't do it anymore because of how often they got yelled at, right?
Oh yeah. It's a big problem now in minor hockey. If we're going to go on a little bit of a tangent, like they're struggling for ref numbers, just because I think there's a lot of factors. Probably I think just the treatment is one of them, especially in minor hockey and amateur levels. Like there's no reason to verbally assault refs in any sport, but it seems to be happening more and more for whatever reason. So that's definitely a problem to address in the larger conversation of reffing. But
Yeah.
Even when there's a culture of respect, like you said, there's always going to be those instances where there's yelling, where there's conflict, and
Well, and that's just, not to go back to my other example, that's sport, right?
yeah,
You're asking them to be competitive and to forego these, health concerns, personal health concerns
yeah,
in pursuit of, winning a game. And with
yeah,
that comes this type of mentality at times. And you can have poise, you can have all those different things and show respect for the ref, but that doesn't mean you can't have a bad day too, and say something you regret later, or have your coach, see him fired up or her fired up on the sideline, and that doesn't get you a little angry at the ref
cool,
to make a little
for sure.
comment here or there,
Yeah,
and so it's complicated.
yeah, complicated is 100 is maybe even an understatement, but yeah, it does get, when you bring in those aspects of competition, like things are going to happen. I think it's just a part of the game. I think refs especially accept that going into it.
Mhm.
But I guess it does, at least from your experience as a player and my experience as a ref, it takes a toll sometimes. So, but I think because that's just it's a part of sport. Like I don't know if we're ever gonna get rid of that. I don't think you can. So there's a bit of acceptance that needs to happen there too, to a degree.
Yeah, and I think, and that's one of the differences I feel around the way rugby has the rule book sort of laid out or established.
Mhm.
It's it's the law book, and
Yeah,
I've heard before that it's not rules, it's laws, and that's because you can debate laws, and it's the spirit of the law rather than a firm rule. And
yeah,
so there is, you might see a guy get chippy behind the referee's back, or something happens, but it's not material, and so it doesn't get called. And so
hmm,
the game management in rugby compared to some other sports is quite different too, which
yeah.
plays into that respect for the match official and the broader sort of respect as a value that's really imposed there in rugby.
Hmm. Hmm. That's a great point. And now that we're on the topic of refs, I want to just turn attention now to your research specifically. And so broadly, based on like the work that you've done and the referees that you've talked to, how have they like, found their experience enforcing this rule, and what are their overall opinions on it, broadly speaking?
I think by and large, the consensus is that this is good. It's a
Okay.
step forward. They like it. They like the idea of it. Newer, younger match officials, less experienced match officials like the idea that it
Yeah.
gives confidence to their decisions. Older match officials will sit there and say, "Well, I always had the power to do this. I don't know what difference a card makes."
Yeah.
But it's just something new from what they've been doing for 20 years. Is that they have to now pull a card for something.
Hmm.
But anyway, and now fill out a report. But that's the consensus. Regardless, they're like, okay, this is good. This is positive. This is going to help inform future decision making. This is going to make newer match officials make their job a little bit easier, and maybe with the formality of the card system, it'll mitigate some of that referee abuse that
Yeah.
comes within those decisions. Is
Yeah.
the thought. Again, it's this coming season. Summer 2022 will be the first year that it's fully implemented
Hmm.
across all levels of competition. So that whether that's true, that remains to be seen. But I think,
Yeah.
the trial went well. The thought process went well. There's been a lot of work going in to develop and get ready for this to be implemented completely in Ontario. And so positive steps there.
Yeah.
When it comes
That
to, sorry, go on.
no, sorry, you go ahead.
I was going to say, when it comes to concerns, some of the concerns were around legality and
Hmm.
liability associated with that,
Oh, yeah.
which really just comes down to good communication coming from the sport administrators on
Hmm.
what the process is, what the liability looks like, how they'll be supported and protected in situations where maybe a blue card, an athlete was concussed but they didn't pull a blue card, or whatever, because situations even above that, situations could happen there. And so obviously there's lots of concerns around that.
Mhm.
Also extending that our previous discussion there on match official abuse, that sort of came out as another concern with that. But I think by and large, the consensus was positive.
That's exciting news, honestly, because I think the governing bodies can do all they want to make rules, but at the end of the day, the officials need to believe that those rules, I mean, regardless, officials have a responsibility to enforce the rule book, but let's not be naive here. Sometimes if a ref doesn't agree with the rule, they may be less likely to enforce it. So I think the fact that they appreciate the rule and are on board with it is going to make it even like that much more successful.
Yeah, and when we look at rules as a means of sort of primary prevention or secondary prevention there, involving stakeholders like the match officials in the decision-making process, in even in research and the working group and so forth, as we look to develop and implement the training materials, all of that stuff really helps solidify that, hey, we're all in this together. We all want the same outcome. Let's work towards this, and this is one step that we can do.
Yeah, that's so, I think that's beyond vital, is including them, because if you can't make decisions about rules without involving the refs, because at the end of the day, they're like we talked about, the people enforcing those rules, so they need to be involved. I think it's great that Rugby Canada made that step. I hope that's something that other like leagues and governing bodies learn from, because I think that's a prerequisite to any successful rule implementation. And just again, continuing on with the ref experience, one question that I was thinking about is that this is a big decision that they would have to make. And so have they expressed any difficulty trying to like discern or determine whether something actually could or couldn't have been a concussion? And if so, is there like an education piece that they might get alongside like their training?
Yeah, so there's some e-learning modules that have been developed. World Rugby has concussion specific training for match officials and coaches and so forth, and all of that again falls under sort of the mandatory pieces of Rowan's Law in Ontario anyway. But broadly, Rugby Canada has that implemented across all levels of Canadian competition. And so there are training, there is education and training to help with the identification. Got to know your signs and symptoms, some questions to ask, what to look for. And this is where, match official sort of training seminars, I think will sort of start happening now that we're returning to competition, where, 6 or 7 match officials might get together and discuss the blue card on a weekend, watch a game together, sort of game film or in person, and talk about the process after, if there's a blue card, if not, what to look for, what not to look for. And so there's lots of match official communities, even, within, not just within like Rugby Ontario sort of governance structure, but even more regionally, you have within the GTA, within Peterborough Kawarthas, within the Ottawa area and so forth. And so there's these development seminars that sort of help with the practice side of things. And, when it comes to the education and concerns about making that 50-50 call, it's if you're thinking if you should make the call, you just make the call.
Yeah,
obviously that's easier said than done in certain situations, but that's the sort of language or direction that's coming from Rugby Canada and World Rugby, is if you're debating whether you should make the call, you should probably just make the call. And that's come up in the interviews too, with match officials, where they've said things like, well, I'm not a physician. I don't know what this looks like. I'm not a medical professional. I'm not even the most medically qualified person on the field. We have our athletic therapist. And so it's like, they recognize the limitation of that. But I think this is where, even though the match official is the person to pull that card, It
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily have to be a decision made in a vacuum. You have
Okay.
coaches, other players, captains, the athletic therapists, like whoever else involved to help facilitate that decision making as well. So it's okay, I didn't get a good look at it. And you have to keep in mind with rugby, it's one match official and 30 guys on the field.
Yeah.
And maybe you have ARs on each sideline. But maybe not. Maybe it's just a guy from each team running a flag, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so, if they're mic'd up and they have ARs, it's okay. Did you get I just saw the guy down. I didn't see, was that a contact to the head? I see he's holding his head or he's covering his face. What's that look like? Or what's
Mhm.
versus, she went down really hard. It looked like she took a big hit. But medical, can you come out and take a look at this? What are your thoughts? Okay, then you
Okay.
go up and you can kind of consolidate, ask a few more questions yourself as the match official. And so this doesn't happen necessarily as they have the final say, but others can help inform that decision.
Okay. And I think that's so important, because like, even as somebody who does school on concussions, and I know maybe a little bit more than, let's say, the average ref about concussions, I would even still feel a lot of pressure or a little bit uncomfortable having to make a tough call like that, especially if I'm on my own. In the case of rugby, so I think having that collaborative aspect and having maybe the opinion of an AT or a player who saw the hit would go a long way to making any ref feel a little bit more comfortable, especially when there is that understanding that maybe they're not the most qualified person, not qualified, but most knowledgeable person. I think that, yeah, I think that's such an important piece. And will probably really aid in like the effectiveness of the rule itself, moving
Yeah.
forward.
Well, and I think what it does is bringing in those other perspectives and allowing that type of support. Also just establishes that, hey, injuries and concussion and player welfare
Yeah,
it's a community wide concern. It's not a
for
match
sure.
official concern. It's not a player concern. It's a rugby concern. It's a sport concern.
Hmm.
You know.
Hmm. For sure. And kind of building on that idea of it's a sport concern, I want to wrap up our interview just with this last question. I think it'll be a good piece to leave off, because we mentioned it a couple of times that this is a really important step that rugby's taking, but we do both think that there's room for other sports to take a lead, to learn from this and sort of take a lead in their own respect. So do you think other sports can and should learn from the blue card rule and adapt it maybe for their own use in the future?
Yeah, I think it lends itself well to the amateur sport level. I know,
Hmm.
obviously, sports like soccer, with a carding system already
Yeah,
established, probably transfers quite effectively to that context. Though, at the same time, the a guy falls down and holds his head trying to draw a penalty or a card or something on the
true.
opponent.
That's true.
Maybe maybe some tactics change in terms
Yeah.
of high level soccer. Um, but I think there is lots to be learned from here, even if it's just the concept of a blue card, and the resulting injury management and injury tracking
Yeah.
system,
Yeah.
um, worked into whatever style of penalization or whatever each sport respectively has. I think as a concept, it's quite transferable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think soccer would be like um, a great next step in terms of sport, because I think soccer is sort of underrated as a high risk sport in terms of concussion. You talked about it. Elbows are flying, balls are getting kicked in people's faces, like head to head contact is more common, I think, than we'd all like to admit that it is. So yeah, I think there's so much to learn from this for other sports. I just hope that that actually comes to light, because I think it's so vital just to protect athletes, especially at the amateur level. Like you said, like injuries are more important. Protecting injuries are more important than who wins this game on a Monday night, between a bunch of 15, 16-year-olds, right? Like we need like
Yeah.
that perspective is so important. So I hope that there's a lot of learning done here.
Yeah, and I think that just gets to the sporting values. You get something if you're at the professional level and you have the resources for the field side medical, the head injury assessments, the team physicians, whatever. That's very different. The values inherent within that sort of sport context are very different than what I go and do on a Saturday on the rugby pitch, right? I want to be able to play my sport until I'm, a lot older than I currently am. And part of that is making sure I respect my health and respect my body and that of others. And so, at that amateur level, I think that, the long-term athlete is something that needs to be established or better understood.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's like a whole nother conversation that we could maybe get into on a later episode, but I do want to be mindful of time. I know you've been taking a lot of time out of your day, and I really appreciate it. That was such an insightful conversation. Thank you again for taking the time to come talk to me and to our listeners about rules, refs, and how they both sort of combine to play a big role in concussion management. So thank you again, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Just before we wrap up for good, I do want to give you a chance to let our listeners know maybe where they can find some of your work. They can listen to your podcast. So if you want to share some of your social media links, feel free to do that right now.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. That's where I post most of my research related stuff, and also some Toronto Maple Leafs hockey commentary that vastly undereducated on for the most part, but I try hard. But I think, in terms of the podcast and blog, it's The Athletic Perspective at theathleticperspective.com, and on Instagram and Twitter as well. So feel free to check that out. If you're interested, you can go and learn more about that on the website. But taking sports science, chatting with athletes and researchers about those topics and sort of breaking that down a little bit. But thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And for our listeners, I've listened to quite a few of Mike's episodes there. If you like this podcast, I'm guaranteeing you like that one. So please go give him a few listens. I think it'll be well worth your time. And with that, I think that brings an end to this month's episode. So thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at concussion.can.toronto. And we'll see you next month for a brand new episode. Take care. HeadCheck Health bridges gaps in concussion care through simple, powerful technology. Join organizations like the Canadian Football League, Trek Factory Racing, the Canadian Junior Hockey League, Eastern Washington University, and Volleyball Canada, who rely on HeadCheck Health to improve communication and optimize care. Visit headcheckhealth.com for more. The music at the beginning of this podcast is by Ben Sound. www.bensound.com.